Hi, this is a continuation of the other video on the recap. I wanted to point out a few interesting things. Of course, this is not the whole in-depth study. I haven't got a video like that yet for each particular section I have. But at this point, I just was going to point out a few things to you. Remember, I said that the laver represents the second furnishing and the second of creation, the second annual feast, the second book of Torah, etc., etc. It also represents the second book of the Brit Hadashah, the New Covenant, which is Mark. Anyway, we'll get to that. I'll make a video on that. But remember, the laver represents unleavened bread, the annual feast of unleavened bread, which is on the 15th, the day after Pesach or Passover. And we find that it also represents Exodus or Shemot, which is the second book of Torah. And that is where the tabernacle is spoken of in detail, starting at chapter 25. Well, that falls on the 15th. What other annual feast falls on the 15th? Number 7, Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, falls on the 15th. And I wanted to point out something to you in the book of Exodus where the tabernacle is found in chapter 25. There are 7 instances, 7 times where the order is given of the furnishings. But they are not in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 order as upon entry at the gate. They are in order of the location, basically. There's 7 times, and these instances first begin at chapter 30. That's the first instance. Chapter 30, verse 26, when it talks about anointing the tabernacle. This is the order that it follows. It starts with 7, talks about the tabernacle. It goes to 6, which is the Ark of the Covenant, which is the most holy place. Then it goes into the holy place, and it begins at 3, 4, 5, which is the table, menorah, golden altar of incense, 3, 4, 5. Then it proceeds to the outer court, and it starts 1, 2, upon entry, altar and laver. The laver is always the last furnishing mentioned. And remember, I told you about the laver representing the book of Exodus where the tabernacle is spoken of. So the 7 instances begin in chapter 30 at verse 26 at the anointing of the tabernacle. And then the second instance of the order is in chapter 31 where it talks about the craftsman. The third instance is chapter 35 where it talks about the materials. The fourth instance is chapter 36 to 38 where it's actually made. The fifth instance is chapter 39 when they present it to Moses. And the 6th time that the order is mentioned in this way is chapter 40, where the erection instructions are given. And then the 7th time this order is given is chapter 40 again, where the erection is complete. The tabernacle is completely set up. And again, the order goes from the tent to the most holy place, to the holy place, 3, 4, 5, to the outer court, 1 2. Okay, another video that I have is about how the furnishings also line up with the offerings in Leviticus. The altar being the burnt whole korban, the burnt offering, and the laver representing the grain offering. Remember, we talked about the laver representing unleavened bread. That's the grain offering. The third offering that's listed in Leviticus is the peace offering, which would represent the table. The fourth offering mentioned is the sin offering. That's in regards to breaking any of the commandments. And then the fifth offering mentioned is the trespass offering. This reminds me of when Yeshua taught the disciples to pray, "Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us." And here we are at the altar of incense at prayer. And then the Yom Kippur would be 6, but that's only once a year that we have that offering. So again, we have the order found in the offerings themselves in the book of Leviticus: the burnt, the grain, the peace, the sin, the trespass, and Yom Kippur. Okay, here's another order in steps of faith. We have the altar representing faith, the laver representing baptism, and then we go into the congregation. We have communion at the table. We have the infilling of the Spirit with the menorah, the fourth step. The fifth step would be a life of prayer before we actually enter into the other realm, the other dimension. We live in a life of prayer. And then 6 would be judgment, or inside the most holy place. And then, of course, our 7th step would be our rest, which we have now in Messiah. But in this world that we still live in, we are waiting for the final rest with Messiah. Faith, baptism, communion, Spirit, prayer, judgment, rest. Here's another account. In my opinion, the Gospels also line up in order of the furnishings, with Matthew being the first book and the first furnishing, the altar. We have genealogy beginning in the book of Matthew. In Mark, we have John the Baptist first on scene there. And in Luke, the third, which would be the table, we have the priest, and just go through that book. I don't have the contents right in front of me, but it's very interesting. There's just so many connections, and we'll go into detail later. But the fourth book would be John, and that represents the light of the world. The menorah talks about light. The fifth book is the book of Acts, where we have prayer in the upper room. And let's see. The sixth book I consider to be Romans, speaks a lot about the mind and the conscience. And the seventh book, Corinthians, If you remember, Corinthians is the book where we find the mention of the body representing the tabernacle, the temple, that sort of thing. So it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, Corinthians. Okay, here's another interesting connection with the body of Messiah. We find the gifts as far as ministry. We have the apostle, that's the altar. The evangelist, that's the laver. Those are both in the outer court. And then we go into the tent beyond the door of Torah, Moses. We have the teacher at the table, the prophet at the menorah, the pastor at the altar of incense lifting prayer, and then, of course, Messiah being the head of the body. Apostle, evangelist, teacher, prophet, pastor, and Messiah the head.